A young man was arrested for reasons that remained unclear, but when the truth finally came to light, he would have to face something no one, especially those who had judged him, could have ever imagined. You won't believe what happens next. In a courtroom full of tension, a judge completely disregarded all the evidence and made the wrong decision. But when new evidence surfaced, could justice still be restored? Join me as we uncover this incredible story. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment below if you want to see the truth unfold. Maple Grove District Court. The courtroom was as dim as a stopped clock, silent, heavy with the weight of anticipation. Faint lights cast shadows across the polished wooden table, creating an atmosphere thick with tension. Judge Victoria Reed sat high on her bench, her posture arrogantly detached, her cold eyes scanning the case files. She didn't look directly at Malik Davenport, the 20-year-old sitting in the defendant's chair. She merely skimmed over him as if he were just another nameless file in a stack of paperwork. No criminal record, just an unreasonable arrest. But to her, this case was a waste of time. Malik was nothing more than a number, just another cog in a system she was far too accustomed to. Malik clenched his fists under the table, his heart pounding in his chest. He was nervous, but he forced himself to maintain a calm exterior. He knew he wasn't a bad person, but all he could see was a courtroom where no one seemed to care about the truth. Judge Reed had already judged him without even listening to his lawyer's defense. The cold glares from her made him feel as if every chance for fairness had been stripped away. He was just an ordinary young man, never broken the law. Why did he have to endure this? "Present your case," Judge Reed spoke, her voice cold as ice. Joel Renshaw, the public defender, rose to his feet, his tone serious but tinged with exhaustion. He had seen too many cases like this, but facing a judge as arrogant as Reed, he couldn't help but feel a sense of disappointment rising within him. He argued that Malik had been unjustly yanked from his car by the police, that it was all just one big misunderstanding. But to Judge Reed, it was just an irrelevant story. Malik listened quietly, unable to stop the growing ache in his chest. The scene in the courtroom reminded him of the moment when he had been dragged out of his car, when no one had listened to him, when the truth was dismissed. And now here he was, being judged and treated like a criminal, even though he had done nothing wrong. Reed leaned back in her chair, unimpressed. "I don't want to waste time with these dramatic tales," she said, her sharp gaze flicking toward Malik. But there was a strange flicker in her eyes as she heard those defenses. At that moment, Malik was no longer a helpless boy. He stood up straight, meeting the judge's gaze with a surprising sense of defiance. Yes, he wasn't the loser here. He was ready to fight. A moment of hesitation passed. Could Malik prove his innocence in the face of a system that didn't care? Malik Davenport sat up straight in the defendant's chair, his breath coming in quick gasps as if the very walls of the room were crushing his chest. The police had stopped his car just because the taillight was broken, but that was only the beginning. When they ordered him out of the vehicle, he asked a simple question: "Why should I get out?" But in response, a strong arm yanked him from the car with no clear reason, no warrant, and no explanation whatsoever. Joel Renshaw, his public defender, stood and moved to the front of the courtroom with an unmistakable weariness. He knew this wasn't the first time he'd faced cases like this, but for Malik, it was a fight for his very survival. They didn't have a warrant. He simply asked why, and they dragged him out of the car like a criminal, Renshaw said, his voice echoing through the courtroom, but no one seemed to care about his defense. Malik tried to stay calm, but the confusion and fear inside him were rising. This scene wasn't unfamiliar to him. He'd seen too many people treated like this before, but now he was the one sitting here with no one to help. He felt as if every right he had, his right to know why he was being arrested, his right to defend himself, his right to be heard, was being stripped away. Judge Victoria Reed remained unmoved in her seat, her cold gaze emotionless, not even sparing a glance at Malik. She dismissed Renshaw's defense with indifference, her eyes flicking over the arguments as if they were of no consequence. What she said and did didn't just make Malik feel forgotten, it made him feel as if he wasn't even worthy of being listened to. This injustice wasn't just happening to him, it was happening to countless others. But now all he could do was fight to prove his innocence. But what happens when a person, simply for asking an innocent question, is thrown into a life-or-death battle within a flawed legal system? Malik knew he couldn't change the system overnight, but if he could win this fight, perhaps he would be the first to make everyone see the truth. Justice, no matter how small, could still prevail. Judge Victoria Reed sat firmly at the bench, her cold gaze fixed on Malik Davenport. She didn't show the slightest concern for the defense being presented by Malik's lawyer, Joel Renshaw, who was struggling to defend his client. The story of Malik being dragged from his car simply for asking a question was dismissed by her, left unacknowledged. He resisted, Reed said, her voice hardening, without hesitation, as if the outcome had already been decided long before. Malik felt as if he was being ostracized by the very system he had placed his trust in, and the hurt began to settle deep within him. The courtroom fell into an oppressive silence. The only sound the quick, shallow breaths of Malik. He felt the injustice like a blow straight to the chest. Reed didn't look at him, didn't see the pain in his eyes. To her, he was just another criminal in a long line of faceless offenders. "I propose a plea deal," she continued, her tone devoid of any emotion. "You'll receive a light sentence, probation, and a few anger management classes. Otherwise, you'll face far worse consequences." Malik felt a fire of rage ignite inside him. It wasn't anger for himself, but for everything he had already endured and everything he would continue to face. People like Reed would never understand him, would never see him as a human being. The fury coursed through him, making his fist clench under the table, his blood boiling. But he didn't speak a word. He simply stared at the judge with an unyielding gaze. All he could do was grit his teeth and endure. But he knew this injustice wouldn't end here. He understood that in life, justice was never handed out easily. And today, he would be the one to stand up and prove that even when everything was stacked against him, he would still fight. Malik's emotions filled the stillness of the room. Anger, frustration, but also an unwavering hope that couldn't be extinguished. He was ready to face everything, even Judge Reed, because he knew this was not the end. The courtroom was suffocating, each second stretching into eternity. Judge Victoria Reed continued to scan through the case file, her cold eyes unblinking. Then a faint sound echoed from the door, drawing the attention of everyone in the room. Zachary Miller, a court officer, entered, carrying a thick file. He walked straight to the bench, his face tense, his hands trembling slightly as he handed the file to the judge. "Your Honor, this is new evidence." Zachary's voice barely cut through the stillness, but it was enough to shake the room out of its silence. Reed glanced at the file, her expression still unreadable, but a strange flicker crossed her face as she flipped through the pages. She paused when she saw the images from the body camera footage, each moment of the video slowly coming into focus. Malik, the man she had dismissed, was yanked from his car without any reasonable explanation. The room seemed to freeze for a moment. Judge Reed stared at the footage, surprise flickering in her eyes. The police report, where the officer had claimed Malik resisted, now contradicted everything the video showed. Malik hadn't done anything. He was simply standing there, dragged from the car like a criminal, with no explanation. The truth was beginning to unfold. But would Reed have the courage to face it? A sense of tension surged in the air. Malik clenched his fists under the table, his heart pounding. He no longer needed a defense. He knew that justice would be served, no matter how much everything had been stacked against him. Reed remained silent, staring at the evidence, then looked up. Her cold gaze now held a trace of uncertainty. For just a second, she realized she couldn't turn back. And in that moment, everything in the courtroom seemed to quiet down, leaving only the truth and the things she had overlooked. A small twist, but powerful enough to change everything. Malik had not been the one at fault, and the truth, though delayed, could still clear away all doubts. The atmosphere in the courtroom had become so heavy and silent, it felt suffocating. Every eye was fixed on Victoria Reed, the judge who had always been confident and sharp, now sitting motionless, her hands clenched tightly around the papers on the bench. Zachary Miller had brought in unexpected evidence, but now Reed could no longer deny the truth. She felt a shift within herself, a change she had never imagined. She had been wrong. Malik Davenport, the man she had dismissed as unworthy of being heard, was now not just a victim of injustice. The footage from the police body camera, every frame proving that he had been dragged from his car without any reasonable cause, made all of Reed's beliefs crumble. She had judged him with a cold gaze from the position of power she had always prided herself on. But now everything had changed. A truth she had never thought possible was now standing right before her. Malik didn't look at her. There was no anger in his eyes, just calmness and determination. His gaze wasn't full of hatred, but of patience. He hadn't lost hope in justice, even though deep down he knew that one day the truth would come to light. But Reed was different. The confusion and regret welled up inside her. How could she have let someone like Malik suffer because of her neglect? She couldn't. There was no other choice but to face the truth. As a judge, she had faced many difficult decisions, but this time was different. Confronting her own mistakes, she had to make a choice that wasn't easy, but the truth could no longer be hidden. Reed took a deep breath, looked at Malik, and rendered her verdict, dismissing all charges against him. For the first time in her career, she felt the weight of justice, the weight that not only Malik had to bear, but also herself. That feeling made her heart tighten, but it also brought a sense of peace. She had been wrong, but at least now she had made it right. The courtroom was shaken when Prosecutor Nathaniel Evans stood up, his voice cutting through the tense atmosphere. "Your Honor, I request an investigation into how this case has been handled," he said, each word striking at the heart of Victoria Reed. She had sat in that judge's chair for years, proud of her career, but now everything was crumbling because of a mistake she couldn't deny. Reed felt her heart tighten, not because she feared losing justice, but because she knew she had been wrong. Evidence had been concealed, a mistake that now couldn't be undone. The room fell into complete silence, no one daring to even breathe. Curious and suspicious eyes were fixed on her, all aware that when the prosecutor called for an investigation, everything could change. Malik sat still, his hands clenched, as if he had already predicted everything that was unfolding. He wasn't pleased that the injustice was finally being exposed, but in his eyes there was a strong belief that justice could still prevail. As for Reed, the feeling of public reproach weighed heavily on her. She could feel the anxiety, the desperation within her, and in that moment, she realized that she had not only wronged Malik, but also all those who had trusted her. The tension stretched on, as if time itself had stopped. She looked directly at Evans, her eyes filled with confusion and exhaustion. He hadn't just accused her in the courtroom. He had exposed to the world the weakness of a judge who had always considered herself untouchable. And as every eye in the room turned toward her, Reed was no longer the strong figure she once was. She could no longer ignore the truth, no longer conceal her mistakes. The tension was palpable, the last glimmer of hope extinguished, and the public's criticism began to seep into every fiber of her being. There was no way out. She had to face the truth about her wrong decision and accept that she could no longer escape the consequences that had come. Judge Victoria Reed stood alone in her office, staring out the window. A soft breeze blew through, but her mind was far from calm. Just a few hours ago, she felt in control of everything, but now everything was rapidly falling apart. The phone on her desk rang, startling her. It was a call from Thomas Bennett, a colleague she had worked with for years, but today his voice on the other end of the line was different. "Judge Reed, I'm afraid you need to brace yourself. The investigation has started. Every decision you've made will now be re-examined." The coldness of that statement sank into her mind, each word landing like a crushing blow. She let her hands drop to her sides, staring at the phone as if it were no longer a tangible object. The career she had spent years building now seemed as fragile as a thin thread. The rulings she had once taken pride in were now cast under the harsh light of doubt. What she had once considered righteous was now nothing more than a series of unanswered questions. The overwhelming sense of failure washed over her like an unstoppable wave. In that moment, Reed couldn't escape the regret. She recalled the trials, the difficult decisions she had made, and now those decisions could have ruined everything. The taunts from Malik, the hateful glares she had seen in the courtroom, now returned to haunt her, and she couldn't avoid the reflection of her own mistakes. Her heart tightened, but there was one thing Reed knew for sure. She couldn't keep running. Even in the face of this crisis, She had to rise up and face the consequences. She had been wrong, but could that ever be fixed? Perhaps the truth itself would be the price she had to pay for her arrogance. Judge Reed lifted her head high, taking a deep breath. From within her swirling turmoil, she knew this battle wasn't over. But could she stand strong as everything around her crumbled? Judge Victoria Reed sat motionless, her hands gripping the papers on her desk. Yet she couldn't stop the trembling that consumed her. It felt like a tidal wave, washing away everything she had once believed in. Before her sat the Judicial Oversight Committee, their stern faces devoid of any empathy. They weren't just criticizing her decisions, they were questioning her integrity and the fairness she had long claimed to uphold. Judge Reed, one of the officials spoke, their voice cold yet sharp. You favored the police and ignored crucial evidence. Your rulings are putting the entire justice system at risk. Each word they spoke felt like a blow to her chest, like cracks that could never be repaired. The decisions she had once taken pride in were now exposed as mistakes. She recalled that moment, the evidence right before her, but she had turned a blind eye, blinded by her unquestioning trust in the system, in those who wore the uniform. She remembered Malik standing there, his gaze not frantic but patiently waiting for justice, and now she was the one facing the consequences. The threat of losing her position hung over her head, and a harsh truth was emerging. Justice could not be manipulated by bias. Every moment in her career now seemed meaningless if she couldn't stand firm in this storm. But in that instant, something shifted within Reed. The pride, the sense of accomplishment she had spent her life building, suddenly felt hollow. She had a choice to make: confront the truth or continue to live within a false shell. Her fate was no longer in her hands. Everything she had done was now exposed to the light, and there was nowhere to hide. The overwhelming sense of disappointment washed over her, but there was also a faint glimmer of hope that somehow, if she could survive this crisis, perhaps justice would truly be served. Not just for Malik, but for herself. Reed lifted her head, took a deep breath, and steeled herself to face whatever would come next. Malik Davenport stood there, his fists clenched, but in his eyes there was no satisfaction or joy at hearing about the investigation targeting Judge Reed. There was no happiness in seeing the woman who had once mocked and dismissed him now facing the consequences of her mistake. All he felt was a weight, a sense that this fight wasn't just his, but that of every other young person oppressed by the system, overlooked and denied the opportunity to challenge these injustices. He looked at Reed, not with hatred, but with a challenge in his gaze. His heart wasn't filled with revenge, but with a profound awareness that it wasn't him who needed to change. It was the system itself. He hadn't asked to be a role model, but what he did today would be a voice for those who had none. This fight wasn't about winning or losing. It was about creating a way out for those who would continue to face powerful forces, forces that would never see them as human. Malik walked out of the courtroom, not with a triumphant smile, but with a quiet belief. He knew the truth had been revealed, but this larger fight would never end here. It would go on, and he would always be a part of it, not just for himself, but for those who would have to face the same challenges he had. His eyes were no longer filled with fear, but with the gaze of someone who had seen the world for what it was, yet refused to accept it as it was. His story wasn't just about a trial. It was about all the invisible people in this society, the ones who never had a chance, the ones who were never heard. And today, Malik wasn't standing up for himself alone. He was standing for all those who would, as Malik Davenport stepped out of the courthouse, the fading light of the afternoon cast his figure not as a victor, but as someone beginning a new, arduous journey. He stood amidst the crowd, not for attention or praise, but because of a firm belief that this fight was far from over. The change he hoped for wasn't just about a judge being fired or a case being exposed. He realized that true change had to begin within each person, from awareness to action. It wasn't enough to replace one individual or one situation and expect a just society. This was the fight of all those who believe in truth and justice. It was the fight of those who aren't afraid to stand up, no matter how powerful the system might be. Malik looked into the crowd, and there was no sign of fatigue or disappointment. He saw the eyes of the young people, those who had once been like him, standing silently, looking at the system they trusted, only to realize it could be flawed. But now they weren't standing alone. They could fight together. That feeling wasn't an end, but a declaration. Nothing changes if only one person speaks up. Malik fought for justice, not just for himself, but for all those oppressed by the system, ignored and denied a voice. The fight goes on, and Malik, with all the hope in his heart, knew that each step, each action, no matter how small, would create a great change in the future. What do you think about Malik's fight? Can justice prevail in a system so full of injustice? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more powerful and emotional stories like this one. The story of Malik Davenport and Judge Victoria Reed offers a profound lesson about fairness, integrity, and the power of standing up for the truth. In a society filled with rules and systems that can sometimes be flawed, the courage to face mistakes is not easy, especially when you hold power. Judge Reed, despite having all the tools to administer justice, fell victim to bias, overlooking crucial evidence and causing justice to be skewed. However, it was Malik, an ordinary person with no power, who was able to bring the truth to light by persisting in his struggle and never giving up. His story serves as a reminder that, no matter how challenging life may be, we can change our lives and the lives of others when we dare to stand up for justice and protect the right values. The key lesson here is that justice doesn't always happen automatically. It requires determination, courage, and a heart that seeks the truth. We should never remain silent in the face of injustice, even if it means confronting difficulties, because once we fight for what is right, change will undoubtedly come.